Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran, and today we are going to be taking a look at Ukrainian partisans or guerrillas or insurgents. These are folks behind the lines without uniforms fighting their own war against the Russians. We're going to break down who they are, what they're doing, and what their goals are. Let's get into it. So first off, we're looking at a nice clip from the BBC profiling one of the Ukrainian partisans. That seems to be the word, but bear in mind that depending on your particular political bent, guerrilla, insurgent, partisan, the demonetized T word, they are all more or less referring to the same thing. These are people outside of formal military command structures, operating against not a contested area, but an area that's broadly under enemy control.
Some of that shadow army. They asked us not to reveal where or who they are.
Ruch Oporu, the resistance movement is huge.
So he is in Kherson, talking about the resistance movement there.
Resistance.
This man told me how the partisans operate behind enemy lines.
Едет колонна, so look here. Someone's driving. They know there's a military base that the occupiers have taken over. So they drive by and film it all. That way we know what kind of kit the Russians have.
The information.
Guys, that is a great illustration of some of the dangerous insurgent tactics, right? When I was in Afghanistan, the Taliban, who were, regardless of your feelings about their politics, they are a very experienced insurgency. And they, for every one gun-toting Taliban, there were probably 10 to 15 that engaged in some sort of non-combat role that was very much like this. You have... So you would obviously, when you think of who is a military threat to you, the term actually in the U.S. is military-aged males. These are men between about 16 and 45 or 50, physically able to wield weapons and engage in warfare. But a good insurgency is going to rely on people outside of that high-threat stereotype. So, for example, a young woman, or particularly young children, right? 9 to 12 might do intelligence gathering operations like this, simply because they're just not treated with the same level of threat. And so exactly, this is a great example. Filming a military base is a simple, but it can also be more complex. Feeding coordinates of military movements or ammunition depots, even things like the layout of a base. Let's say the Russians contract Ukrainian locals to clean, right? This is a big threat for the US. Well, those cleaners can actually get the entire layout of a base, sometimes measuring exact distances by checking how many steps it is between, say, the latrine and the dining hall, right? And so by getting these sort of precise measurements and producing a perfect sketch of the base, you can feed that to your armed faction, your armed wing, in this case, the Ukrainian armed forces, who can use it to either direct precision strikes or even have their special forces teams, or simply provide a better intelligence picture of the areas so that when Ukrainian forces enter them, they know exactly what to expect. Even sometimes you can tease out information that you don't necessarily think of. Let's say you don't really know how many Russians are at that base. Well, if you know how many trucks of food are arriving every day, you can tease out about how many Russians are working there. And that sort of intelligence is easy to gather. It can be gathered by, again, 2 or 3 12-year-olds, logging things on their cell phone while they play soccer in front of the base. It can be logged by a grandma who stands in line at the grocery store looking at apples. You can also do things like discerning schedules. When do patrols leave the base? When do they come back? When are there a lot of movement? When is there not that much movement? So this sort of intelligence gathering is partisan activity but it relies on the comparative advantage of a partisan, which is that they are, by definition, not considered active combatants. And so that ability to collect intelligence for the better armed active combatants is invaluable. And it's a skill, again, the ability to record surreptitiously, but also just to record information accurately and timely is a valuable and an invaluable skill for a partisan.
Is then passed on to Ukraine's military. Another team flies drones across the front line, hunting down more targets. They're civilians, not soldiers, but they joined the fight to stop the occupation of Kherson becoming permanent.
Right, so one of the things you see, guys, is that they are depicted as wearing, military fatigues. They have their IBAs, they have assault rifles, and yes, you can absolutely have partisans that operate that way, but one of the better, in my opinion, better calls as a partisan is to look as civilian as possible. Again, you want to look like you have some other role. A classic one in the Iraq War was literally dressing up as police. You would dress up in police uniforms and would get police vehicles, oftentimes by killing Iraqi police, and you would drive to the insurgents, rather, the insurgents would drive to usually soft targets. These would be government facilities, the houses of people who were working for the U.S. government or the U.S.-backed Iraqi government, and would conduct assassinations, right? So this was a very common tactic, but the key was to look like something else, look like a farmer, look like a police officer, look like a garbage man, anything but looking like a combatant. So now you also, of course, if you want to be armed, you want it to be a little more concealable than what you're seeing there with a full-size assault rifle.
Resistance is dangerous, though. Denis Mironov was caught gathering intelligence and weapons for the partisans. He was beaten so badly, he died in custody. His mother has evidence Denis was tortured by Russia's FSB.
Okay, so she describes what they did to her son. It's not good. We're going to fast forward through that. I personally don't want to hear that description again.
But it looks like the fight back for Kherson has begun. Ukraine says it's destroying Russian ammunition depots, hitting key bridges to disrupt their supply lines.
Right, this is another great example of what partisan operations can do. Not only they can feed intelligence to the main armed forces, including target data, but they themselves can conduct sabotage operations, sometimes in a way and with a level of patience that conventional armed forces simply can't, right? The only tool Ukraine has to take out, say, a bridge is basically their HIMARS system, right? But there's only so many rockets and only so many targets. And that system has a limited range. So if you have partisans, if you can get them explosives and orient them just a little bit on how to disable or destroy a bridge system, they can be much, much, much more effective, right? You could use a $1 million HIMARS rocket to take out a bridge, or you could literally have probably about $200 of TNT to achieve nearly the same effect with partisans. And you have to think that as well, partisan activity doesn't have to even be effective to be effective. Now, here's what I mean. If you are a partisan, right, or you're Russia, you're occupying Kherson, and you realize that all of your bridges are constantly being targeted. And maybe they're not destroyed, but maybe they are disabled. Your rail lines are constantly being destroyed in places. And so you say, okay, well, we're going to solve this problem. So we're going to divert an entire company, an entire battalion, to just securing these rail lines and these major supply lines. Well, now those partisans, maybe a dozen, maybe 24 of them, have taken an entire hundreds of soldiers, maybe even thousands of soldiers, and pulled them away from the front lines and stuck them where they're not actually fighting the Ukrainian army. They're fighting to drive up and down a bridge that the partisans probably are not going to touch while there's troops on them. This is why the US spent so much money in Afghanistan and Iraq, trillions of dollars. The reason is because stopping, securing anything against partisan or guerrilla attacks is so resource intensive, because it's like, imagine if you had to make sure that no one ever drove down a street in your house. Let's say you're just a random, you say, I'm not going to let a specific person drive down. I don't know, your brother, your annoying brother. You're like, I'm not going to let him drive down my street. What does that mean? Well, your annoying brother can show up at any time, day or night, whenever he wants, get in his car and drive. But you have to maintain 24/7 surveillance. So you see how stopping the insurgent activity is way more intensive and way more difficult than performing the insurgent activity. Now, obviously, there's no substitute for taking and holding territory, right? But when you combine partisan activity with conventional armed force operations, you have a really potent combination that can really prove to be a drain for the defending or occupying forces. One of the other things that they'll talk about in a bit is the efforts against the Russian government, or the Russian-backed government,
are starting to make a difference here. And so, this fighter tells me, is the resistance. He had to flee Kherson to escape arrest for his own activity behind the lines. But he tells me the Russians have very little real support there.
Of course, the Russians have scared people, physically and psychologically. But the vast majority want life to be like it was before the invasion. They are waiting for Kherson to be freed,
So this is another great point he makes, is that so you have the combatants, a small number of people actually performing like combat operations, blowing things up, shooting people, etc. You have tenfold number that are engaging in non-combat partisan operations, intelligence gathering, moving supplies to and from, operating safe houses. But then you have an even larger contingent. And this larger contingent are people who are broadly sympathetic to insurgent efforts. And this is best thought of as sort of, if you've ever seen this show, an American example of this would be if you've ever seen one of the murder investigation shows, that when there's a murder in some communities, right, there's simply no one cooperates with the police. Police come in, they want to do an investigation into what happened, but there's a broad sympathy for the community and an antipathy towards the police. And so there's just a culture of, hey, we don't really snitch. Did you see anything? Nah, I didn't see anything. Right? And when you have that broad sympathy, even though they're not active, they're sort of passive in the face of loyalty, right? And when you have that, that is the lake, that is the river, the ocean that the fish of the insurgency swims in, if that analogy makes sense, right? Just having this broadly sympathetic populace where you're reasonably certain that, people are going to be, are just not going to go out of their way to make your life difficult. In some ways, even support it, Again, a partisan knocks on your door and says, hey, listen, we just need to stay here for a night. You might say, well, okay. If the Russians show up, you go, oh, they forced their way in. We didn't have a choice. We were so scared. But they leave and you don't call anybody. That's the sort of passive support. You see somebody, you have a neighbor who, sometimes goes off late at night. He seems to have a lot of duffel bags. You don't say anything. That's the support we're talking about. And that is so valuable to an insurgency. Without that, right, someone's going to pick up the phone and call. They're going to say, I think this guy's doing something. I think this person is an insurgent. Or, you know, when they need even just like low-level passive support, they're not going to be able to find it. So the other thing I want to talk about, and this is actually one of the best interviews with a partisan that I've seen. I'm using, again, partisan, insurgent, guerrilla, to pick your term, is this AP article, right, about Ukrainian resistance. And let's see if we can find it. So, okay. They interview with an insurgent who says, we're giving the Ukrainian military precise coordinates for various targets. And the guerrillas' assistants make the HIMARS even more powerful. We're invisible behind Russian lines, and this is our strength, right? He realizes that actually killing the Russians is the Ukrainian army's strength. So they rely on their comparative advantage of being invisible. But they're not visible. They're just hiding in plain sight, right? So again, feeding coordinates, super powerful. They coordinate with the Ukrainian military special operations forces. This is a very U.S. way of operating. When we talk about Green Berets who do indigenous nation support, this is what they talk about, where they coordinate with partisans who are already operating and are able to translate the partisans' efforts into real military actionable intelligence. So they might say to them, hey, listen, our headquarters, we really are curious about the location of ammunition dumps. We think there's 2 or 3 around here. Do you guys know anything about that? Or can you find out about it? And somebody goes, yeah, you know what? I'm going to call my grandmom and she's going to go visit her friend in such and such. And she'll drive through where you think this ammunition dump is. And she'll get some footage of it. And then she'll get some footage on her way back. And they'll say, beautiful, perfect. Right, and then she'll tell me the location, and I'll tell you guys. That's a classic, super low risk, right, way to provide military support in sort of an unconventional partisan way. Of course, the forces are also the special operations forces are also actually set up a website on how to organize resistance, prepare ambushes, and elude arrest. There's also a network of weapons caches and secret hideouts in occupied areas. This is what we talked about. The secret hideouts are probably safe houses, is a better way to think of it. Now, the other thing that they're doing is assassinations, right? They're placing explosives in administrative buildings, at collaborating officials' homes, or on routes to work. It talks about the Kherson prison chief, again, occupied Kherson prison chief, a police vehicle hit by shrapnel, deputy head of local administration were targeted. So there are a lot, including they have bounties out on some of the major officials. This, of course, has, as we talked about, made Moscow divert anti-guerrilla units to Kherson, right? And let's see, there's a nice summary here with everything that they are aspiring to do. Okay, the resistance movement, this is the best distillation of how to run a modern partisan movement. Resistance movement has 3 goals. Destroy Russian weapons and means of supplying them, so targeting supply routes, ammunition depots, etc. Discrediting and intimidating the occupiers and their collaborators, i.e. targeting their efforts to establish a legitimate government in the occupied areas, and informing Ukrainian special services about enemy positions. That's it. Those are the big 3 for an insurgent movement. That's how to run it, right? So, guys, as always, thank you so much for joining me on this video. Let me know in the comments if there's anything else you want to check out. And do me a favor, I also, if you haven't seen, have an episode of my podcast out where I interview the U.S. Army veteran, former intel officer who now runs the Kamikaze Cash trading channel, a true Wall Street bets legend. Anyway, guys, thanks so much for joining me. I'll see you in the next one.